Okay, so how do we go from nothing to something in a community? One way ecologists think about population persistence, which ultimately shapes the community if we think that the community has an open structure, is through a series of filters. And there are sort of three filters that we can think about: historical, abiotic, or environmental, and biotic. Right? So imagine we've got a world like this. We switch to the boreal community. We've got some regional species pool. There's a whole bunch of species in the state of Indiana. But if you go out into, say, the closest forest to your house right now, which if you can socially distance, I recommend, you're probably going to find fewer species in that local community than in the whole state of Indiana, right? And the idea then is that there's these series of filters that basically remove species as you work your way down. So one of those filters is a historical filter, right? So in that picture of the grassland in Illinois, some of the features of that landscape have to do with the history of human activity. Right? One of the historical filters is potentially evolution, right? The species I find in the boreal forest in North America are different from the one you find in the boreal forest in Russia because evolution took different paths in those separated continents. Right? And so another way to think of a historical filter is through the alternative states in the ESS. Remember, you can get two different solutions that depend on who got there first, right? That's a version of an historical filter. The next is an environmental filter, right? If you go out to the forest, your closest forest in Indiana, there's a reason why there aren't palm trees there. It's because they can't survive the winter, right? There aren't cacti there because cacti have expensive adaptations to water limitation that aren't necessary, and so on, right? So part of what determines the species you'll find near your house is simply what environments you have near your house. And then lastly, we've got the biotic filter, right? These are all those other games other than alternative stable states, right? The different sorts of interactions that we got in the various games that I've showed you then shape what's found in the local community. And much of community ecology is about understanding these biotic and abiotic filters. The problem with the historical filters is that it can be a little bit difficult to always know the details, although sometimes molecular tools make that a little bit easier, right? So remember when we made our hypotheses about what determined the distribution of jack pine, it was the environment and negative interactions with predators, right? And remember when we talked about zero net growth isoclines or zingies. Again, this was about environments that had positive and negative population growth. Right, so this is an environment where the population growth is negative. So if you have too little of these two resources, these are environments where whatever species that the zingy represents, they can't persist in these environments, but they can persist in these environments. And so a lot of community ecology is about understanding these filters. And so that's the concept of filters and how those different filters might be shaping communities. It can be, in some sense, a little bit metaphorical because, you could imagine then if there are, again, these many thousands of dimensions in a community, you can't really draw a picture with 1,000 zingies on it, right? I can't make that many maps and probably make sense of them. So there are other ways that community ecologists use to think about communities, but this idea of filters is a really common concept that you'll come across. Another way that, as we move on with our discussion of communities, another way that ecologists have thought about communities is by thinking about the process of succession or community assembly. So imagine a major disturbance, like a volcano eruption or a really bad tornado or a glacier recedes. The composition of communities often passes through a somewhat predictable set of stages as it approaches something like a bunch of population level equilibria. Ecologists call this succession. And succession is one of those things that is an Indiana story. So another very old white dude, Henry Coles from the University of Chicago, was studying the Indiana sand dunes, which we've talked about before, in the 1800s. And this was around the time that people were really starting to think carefully about the fossils that they were finding. Geologists were realizing that as you went deeper in space, you were actually going deeper through time. And this idea of sort of substituting space for time was very much in the air. And so what he figured out when he was studying the communities of the sand dunes was that you could do the same thing. Dunes that were further from the lake were older, and therefore he thought that he could, or he showed that you could substitute space for time. So as you go from dune 1 to dune 2 to dune 3, etc., all the way, you actually are seeing what the community was like, because the lake has been slowly receding over time, creating dunes in front of it since the glaciers left. And he did this at the Indian sand dunes, right? So it's a beautiful place. I really recommend you go, right? So you've got really amazing sand beaches that are really nice in the summertime if this pandemic ever ends. And you can imagine that those first dunes have almost no vegetation on them, or if they do, it's a little bit of grass. But gradually, you get more and more community development through time. So, right, first what you get is organisms like cyanobacteria, lichens, mosses, maybe bacteria that can colonize bare sand or bare rocks. You can imagine that's a very small set of organisms that can tolerate such a harsh environment. But it might be nice because there's relatively few interactions, right? If you can get on a bare sand beach, you might not have any competition to deal with. But over time, you start to get herbaceous plants and shrubs that often have symbiotic nitrogen fixation mutualisms. They start to colonize and they start to increase soil nitrogen, right? So you could imagine that as herbaceous plants start to establish on the dunes as they get older and older, they start adding organic matter to the sand, like roots, like decaying leaves, and then gradually, over enough time, this can really stabilize the sand and start to create something much more like soil. Eventually, the soil gets stabilized and rich enough that allows trees to grow. And if you think about, height competition, right? As soon as you start to get tall things like trees, that's probably bad news for the shrubs. So what you're seeing here is a view, a picture I took, a view from one of these dunes where you can see shrubs and herbaceous plants, but behind it is the next dune that actually has an oak forest. And what's interesting about these is that occasionally you kind of get these alternative stable states where most dunes are dominated by oak forest, but few of them are dominated by jack pine for reasons, again, that probably have to do with the history of who got there first. So that's where the jack pine is hanging out in Indiana, is in these few sand dunes where it, for whatever reason, is the dominant tree. Right, you can imagine there are three factors that determine the order that species invade, right? Part of it is the rate at which they can disperse. Right, so you can imagine that oak acorns are probably not traveling down to the dunes as fast as, say, a grass seed might be able to blow. Changes in the environment over time matter, right? Even if an acorn got down to the beach, it probably couldn't grow in bare sand. And then changes in ecological interactions over time, right? As soon as you have trees, the grasses and stuff probably can't grow as well in the shade of those trees as they can out on the open dunes closer to the lake, right? So those three factors: dispersal, the environment, and ecological interactions. And if you remember, this is basically those three environmental filters, right? History, environment, and biotic. Ecologists frequently distinguish between two types of succession. So primary succession is the colonization of an area that has never been occupied by organisms before, or it's sort of a new the slate has been wiped clean. So the dunes are a good example of that. There probably were species in the lake before the dune came out of the lake and started forming, but it's a completely different world once it's on land. Primary succession is really slow. Secondary succession is where something severe has happened to remove the pre-existing community, but the community begins to rebound. So you could imagine a forest fire, or a farmer has cleared the forest to farm, but then abandoned that field. The Ross Reserve actually was like this. Purdue's Ross Reserve was used as a cattle farm until the 1940s, and then it was abandoned. And now, if you go there, all those cattle fields are forest. The secondary succession can be quicker because there's already soil, probably. There's already nutrients. There may be surviving individuals whose seeds don't have to travel as far to get and established in the secondary succession phase. And so you might ask yourself, is there an endpoint to succession? Sometimes this is called the Climax community, and actually Clements was a big advocate of the Climax community. It's a static, deterministic endpoint of succession, right? So in the sand dunes, like I said, if we take a walk up to that oak dune that was in the back of the picture, it looks something like this. You can still see sand on the ground, but there's much more soil and it's dominated by oak trees. But like I said, some of them, for who knows what reason, are completely dominated by jack pine forests. These are relatively rare, but in the jack pine forest, you don't get any oak trees, and in the oak forest, you don't get any jack pine. So there's probably not such a thing as a climax community instead, right? The landscape is a mosaic of different communities with individuals that are being born and dying and dispersing, and the interactions may shape. So something about the pines may prevent oaks from establishing due to the biotic filter, and something about the oak trees might stop the pine trees from establishing, right? So going back to our Clements and Gleason debate, again, Gleason was probably the one who was ultimately vindicated with his hypotheses. So ecologists have used successions and experiments that sort of force secondary succession to, we could disturb a community and to attempt to discover the rules that govern how communities assemble. Is there a way to figure out a series of rules that get us from a dune to an oak or a pine-dominated dune? Unfortunately, we're not very good at predicting communities. If you remember, most of my lectures have been structured such that I've showed you some kind of math that allows us to make pretty good predictions about interactions, at least in simple systems. But these 100-dimensional communities were just not very good at making predictions beyond 2 or 3 species, even to this day. So most of ecology is still about simply describing communities. And to do that, we use several indices of diversity, which I am going to, I think, tell you in the next video. So we'll stop this here, and we'll talk about different ways of describing communities to simplify the high dimensionality of them.